Okay. Got a few more folks logged in, so welcome everyone. And thank you for making the time this evening. And so this event is sponsored by the Woodlands Partnership of Northwest Massachusetts. This is a unique collaboration to both conserve our forests and support the rural land-based economy of the Berkshire region and supporting local municipalities in northern Berkshire and western Franklin counties. And my name is Lisa Hayden. I work for New England Forestry Foundation, and I've served as administrative agent for the Woodlands Partnership since 2021. And just for a little background, if you're not familiar with the organization, the partnership is a public body serving 21 municipalities with a board that includes a rep from each member town, as well as our regional planning agencies, watershed associations, land trusts, the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, economic and community development agencies, Indigenous partners, and the Society of American Foresters, as well as state and federal partners. So we're a diverse group and been operating since 2021 with an earlier history too, with of people getting together to think about this collaboration. But more information is available at our website, woodlandspartnership.org. And this webinar is part of an ongoing series titled How Do Forests Grow? And we're very grateful for grant support from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs for some of these programs. I also wanted to mention that our current board chair, Dickin Crane, will be hosting a woods walk coming up later this month with Ethan Tapper in Windsor, Massachusetts. And that's going to be on Sunday, April 26th from 10 a.m. to noon. And so if you're in the region of Western Mass later this month, you can reach out. We can get you registered for that as well. And so our format this evening will be hearing from our guest speaker for maybe close to an hour, and then a brief discussion of some of the key themes that he talked about. And then we invite you all to enter your questions into the Q&A box. And we will have plenty of time at the end, we hope, to answer all your questions. And we will be recording the session, and we'll share the recording as soon as we can afterwards. And now I want to turn it over to Henry Art, who is our first board chair, to introduce our guest speaker.
Well, welcome to Loving and Managing Your Forest, a long-term relationship. I'm Henry Art, a previous Williamstown representative to the Woodlands Partnership, former chairman of its board, and an emeritus professor of environmental studies and biology at Williams College. Today's webinar is part of a Woodlands Partnership public outreach addressing important issues in how to understand and sustainably manage our forests and woodlands. We need to respect and be informed about their ecologies, their histories, cultural importance to our region, and the ecosystem services such as clean air, fresh water, carbon sequestration, and protection of biodiversity that forests provide us all. We are planning for future webinars on indigenous forests of the region, forest health issues, forest carbon relationships, and forests of the future. Today, the subject is how do forests grow and change over time, and how can people support that process? Tonight, it's my privilege to introduce Ethan Tapper, who is a forester, ecologist, and digital storyteller. He is an author who works, writes, hunts birds, and runs a small consulting forest business at his home at Bear Island, his 175-acre working forest, homestead, orchard, and sugar bush in Bolton, Vermont, as well as playing in his punk band, the Bubs. Ethan is recognized as a thought leader in the landscape of ecosystem stewardship. His best-selling book, How to Love a Forest, The Bittersweet Work of Tending a Changing World, has been named the winner of the 2025 New England Book Award for Nonfiction. Tonight, he will be giving an overview of the recent history of our regional forests and exploring strategies that can be used for their sustainable management today and in the future. So it's with pleasure I turn the proceedings over to Ethan.
Hey, hey everybody. Nice to see some familiar names on there on the attendees list, and I'm really excited to talk to you all. And I'm really excited in particular because I've been doing all of these events all over the place, and this is the first one that I've done in a while where it's like not about me and it's not about my book. It's just about forests and a topic that basically any student of forest ecology, forester, ecologist, biologist, or otherwise, is fascinated by, which is placing ourselves in this context of history. And the reason why that's important is because it's really, really important that we understand how ecosystems work. It's really, really important that we understand why the ecosystems that we know and love, these things that we call forests and wetlands and all these other things, are the way that they are, and how that informs then what we do. And so I'm really excited to just like dig into this dorky history stuff with you guys, and then to talk about in what ways this informs like our present day practice. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do another thing that I never get to do, which is use a PowerPoint. Here we go. All right.
We got it.
So that's me. Um, uh, as Hank mentioned, I'm a forester, ecologist. Now I say that I don't really know what I am because I've been on this adventure of like being an author and touring around giving talks at lots of places all over the country, and then doing this like social media stuff. And yeah, but that's me. You can follow me on all the socials at How to Love a Forest, and that's the name of my book. And we'll see if I can get it to change. Yes. Okay. So this beautiful and startling picture is a picture of an old growth forest. And so I think that one of the first things that I really like to talk about is this thing that, you know, most forest lovers love, at least in concept, in principle, which is this idea of an old growth forest. And I love old growth forests too. I think it's important that we ground ourselves as we get into this topic of what's an old growth forest. And then we're going to, of course, bring this forward and figure out what this tells us about what we do today. In what an old growth forest actually is. So an old growth forest is not a forest with a bunch of big trees. An old growth forest is a forest that has never seen extensive disturbance from like non-indigenous peoples. And that last part is because we know that indigenous peoples had some role in stewarding our ecosystems more in some places than in others. But what we really are seeing is these essentially like undisturbed forests forever. And if you see them in a research context, they'll call them primary forests. These are forests that have never been cut or cleared, essentially. And that changes a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about fire later, and that complicates it a little bit. There's other words for this. People call them climax forests. In the ecological parlance, we'll sometimes call them late successional forests. And what that means is that there's this process of forest development that we call succession. It's called that because it's characterized by this series of like stages, each of which follows or succeeds the last. And you end up at the end of, you know, some period of time at this stage of late succession, essentially old growth. Old growth forests are characterized by, you know, not being this park-like area of all of these just like big, massive trees, as much as they're characterized by these qualities of diversity and complexity. So what we see, especially here in the northern forest, is these relatively closed canopy forests that are multi-generational. They have some big old trees, but also all different sizes and ages of trees. They have tons of dead wood on the ground. They have dead standing trees. They often will have this lumpy, what we call pit and mound microtopography, which comes from hundreds or thousands of years of trees tipping over. When they tip over, they pull their root system out of the ground, creating a pit where the root system was. That then upturned root system decomposes into that mound. And so when you walk through this old growth forest, one of the characteristics that can let you know that maybe it might be an old growth forest is that it has that sort of undulating microtopography. But of course, if we were to walk into this forest, we would say maybe that it looks messy, right? That's the term that a lot of people will use to describe these forests. And in the ecological parlance, what most people call messy, we call complex. There's this quality that old growth forests have, which we call complexity. You'll see it sometimes referred to as structural diversity or structural complexity. And really what complexity is all of these layers of diversity, all of these different conditions layered atop each other that creates these properties. We call them emergent properties, where a forest becomes greater than the sum of its parts, which is really, really, really cool. And yeah, so basically, when you're looking for these old growth forests, you're looking for a couple of key attributes. You're looking for some big trees, but not a lot, often like 10 to 12 big trees per acre. You're looking for that multi-generational structure, many different sizes and ages of trees. You're looking for deadwood on the ground. You're looking for that undulating microtopography. But if you go to any part of the country, what a late successional or old growth forest looks like will actually be really different. So this is a slide to remind me to talk to you about other elements of diversity. So we do not think that we had, let's say, going back before the 1500s on this landscape, we don't think that we had a landscape where all of the forests were the same. We think we had this landscape that was this mosaic of all of these different types and ages of forests. So there were some forests that had relatively recently experienced a relatively major natural disturbance, maybe a big windstorm, maybe a passenger pigeon flock, which I'll talk about later. Some like larger scale disturbance, we'd call that early successional forests. And those would be patterned with these later successional forests, and forests really in all different stages of development, forests of all ages and types and expressions. And so what we want today is not just like this landscape that's this monoculture of this one good thing. We actually want this landscape which is very, very diverse. And in some ways, I think about that landscape as sort of mirroring that complexity that we find in those old growth forests. So here's another terminology, a term for you to learn, which is that. So we have that structural diversity, right? Sometimes called multi-generationality, combined with things like dead standing trees and deadwood on the ground. A lot of times when we talk about that in forests, especially old growth forests, we talk about vertical structural diversity. And you can picture vertical structural diversity as being this multi-layered canopy. So you have some little trees and some middle-sized trees and some old trees all growing together in these vertical layers. But what we also have is what's called horizontal structural diversity, which is where we have pockets of trees of different ages and different heights across the landscape. And we actually want a mix of vertical and horizontal structural diversity, as well as this bigger concept of landscape level diversity. Now, one of the things that I've become fascinated with recently, which you will know if you follow me on social media, is critters. And there is no critter that is more of a big part of our historic landscape in the East. And of course, this is not a picture from the East, but more a part of our historic landscape from the East than the beaver. And beaver are interesting because we consider them an ecosystem engineer and a keystone species. If you don't know what a keystone species is, it's basically a species that has a disproportionate positive impact on the other species in its environment. And the analogy of the keystone is that an ecosystem is like this stone arch, all these stones stacked on top of each other. And then there's one stone right here that if you pull it away, everything comes tumbling down. And so the beaver, what they do is they build these dams and they impound water. And as they do that, they create this whole succession of all of these really different important habitats, from these open water habitats, which are really important to whole groups of different species of reptiles, amphibians, and fish, and other mammals, birds, to this succession of habitat that follows even after the beavers are gone. So they'll sort of like eat a lot of the available food, and then they might move on. The dam goes away, and you end up with sort of these secondary wetland environments. You'll end up with these things that we call beaver meadows, which support species like a lot of our herbaceous species like jopaiwi and goldenrod. And so across our landscape prior to colonization, we had an abundance of beavers that is incredibly hard to imagine. We probably had, in Vermont at least, 300 beaver dams per square mile. a square mile rather, is 640 acres. So that's a beaver dam every 2 acres in our valleys. And so probably like a lot of the environments around these streams, like what you think of as a stream channel, would really not have been what it looked like for thousands of years until just a few hundred years ago. Now, the beaver were the first animal to really experience the impacts of colonization, because even before any of this settler colonialism was happening, beaver were being trapped by the hundreds of thousands. They were being trapped because their pelts were really valuable. They used them in millinery, which is hat making. And there were, you know, white trappers, and also white trappers that created this trade economy where they were sort of incentivizing indigenous folks to sell them beaver hides in exchange for all of these incredibly amazing things like steel pots. One thing that I think about around this time of year is like, imagine if you're an indigenous person who's been boiling maple sap in, you know, a wooden trough or a rawhide pot by taking like hot rocks and putting it into that pot until it boils, until you have maple sugar. Imagine how much it would change your life if you could boil maple sap directly in a metal pot. You know, so they created this economy that then really led to beaver being trapped in these huge numbers. And by the late 1600s, there were hundreds of thousands of beavers being shipped to Europe from the Connecticut River Valley alone. It's pretty incredible to think about. And by the end of the 1600s, beaver were effectively extirpated from the Northeast. And by the end of the 1800s, they were gone from almost their entirety of their historic range in the United States, I should say. And they actually incited a series of regional conflicts between indigenous peoples because beaver became, because of this economy that Europeans created, beaver became this really valuable commodity. And there's a whole story about that in the beaver wars of the 1600s. But anyway, so even when it's hard to think about, but when in Massachusetts, this would be in like the 1700s, in Vermont, this would be more like the 1800s, when the first settlers, European settlers, came here, beaver hadn't been here for 100 years, which is pretty wild to think. Like, they wouldn't have even known that as something that was part of our landscape, even though they had been such a crucial part in creating this whole succession of different habitats for thousands of years. This is a species that's known as the eastern elk, and this is an Audubon painting from his amazing book, Viviparous Quadrupeds of North America. Audubon, of course, not the best guy, pretty bad guy, but did provide some pretty amazing illustrations in his book, Birds of America, and then Quadrupeds of North America. I put this up here because this elk is a species that I'm thinking about right now. We have one species of elk, Cervus canadensis, that was historically present across the entirety of North America with 4 different subspecies. By the end of the 1700s, the elk was basically disappeared from much of the eastern United States. But one thing that I think about is that, like, we think of elk as this western species, right? We think of them, there's 4 subspecies out west. There's the Rocky Mountain elk, the Manitoban elk, the Roosevelt elk, and the Tule elk. And if it just, by a nuance of history, colonization had occurred from the west coast to the east instead of from the east coast to the west, we might think of this species as an eastern species. And same with bison, actually, and same with wolves. And so this elk, you know, we now call it the eastern elk. It's extinct, Cervus canadensis. We now have some eastern populations of elk that have been reintroduced, especially most successfully in Kentucky. But the oldest reintroduction is in Pennsylvania, where in 1913 they brought elk over on a train from Yellowstone. But you know, we now call it the eastern elk. But what Audubon called it, and what they called it back in the day, was actually the American elk. So it's as much of an eastern species as a western species. And this is also, you know, to say that during this time period of early colonization, it's called by historians the Age of Extermination, or the Great Barbecue, because it's when we lost all of these species that used to live here. So in Vermont, we had caribou until 1840. We had elk, we had wolves, catamounts, beaver, turkey, otter, fisher, all of these things that by the end of the 1800s were gone. Some of them were introduced, which we'll talk about in a second, and others were not. Here's another one that I really, really like. Audubon has a famous picture of this one as well, the passenger pigeon. It's pretty hard to imagine what it was like having passenger pigeons on the landscape. There is some complexity in even trying to reconstruct how present they were on the landscape historically. But they occupied our region in these mega flocks of billions of birds. And Audubon actually has a story about it in Birds of America, where he talks about just an area where passenger pigeons had decided to hang out for a while. It looked like the forest had been swept by a tornado, and that there were trees 2 foot in diameter broken off 2 feet above the ground, and that the whole understory was smothered in inches of their guano just by the flock of this volume, this many birds standing there. And one of the things that we think about, in addition to sort of like reconstructing these historical forest patterns, also think about reconstructing these animals that were here and how they were here. And that's true certainly for the beaver, probably for the passenger pigeon, that they not only like lived in these forests, but they also affected them, right? They also actually changed the shape of these ecosystems and changed how they function. So that's another one. I write about passenger pigeons in How to Love a Forest too. And there were, in addition to all of these species that used to be here that were lost, there are also species that are here now that were never here historically. This is one of them, the red fox, which was probably first seen in Massachusetts, maybe in the early 1800s, maybe a little bit later. This is a boreal species. And actually, when I was going to forestry school, we were told, because it was the most current information, that all the red foxes we had were European. And the reason for this is because what people saw is that in the 1700s, Europeans came over here. It was a big trend to hunt red fox, European foxes, which is actually probably the same species, to hunt them on horseback with dogs. And they came over here and there's no red foxes anywhere. And so they started releasing red foxes in the 1700s, especially like in the area of Maryland. And lo and behold, there started to be foxes everywhere. And so they were like, well, these European foxes have caught on and they're spreading all over the place. They did genetic analysis starting in the mid 2010s of these red foxes and found that they're basically all North American red foxes. So this is a population that spread from where they were, which was maybe the southern end of their range, would have reached down as far as northern Vermont historically, that just spread all the way to now, Florida. Pretty amazing. Here's just a rundown of some other species that were never in New England historically. Possum, first seen in Vermont, 1940s, probably a little sooner in Massachusetts. The cardinal, same thing. The cardinal, I'm sorry, is 1970s. Coyotes, I think they were probably first seen in Massachusetts, like around the 50s. This is one of my very favorite birds. This is a chimney swift. I just put it in here because I think it's such a remarkable bird. I'm really excited for them to come back pretty soon. I went to a presentation in Indiana with this amazing guy. I wish I could remember his name, and I'm sorry if you're out there. Amazing biologist who described this as our last old growth animal, which is very interesting because we literally named this species after chimneys. So the interesting thing about chimney swifts is that they're one of these species that is a highly old growth dependent animal. And the reason for that is because they roost where they roosted for thousands of years was in these big hollow trees. They roost vertically like a bat. And then when our landscape was cleared, as I'm about to talk about in a second, they lost all those roost trees. And they figured out that a chimney was a pretty good place to roost. And now they're actually they went from being a highly dependent old growth animal to being a highly human dependent animal. And they've actually been declining as chimneys are less commonly used. So the big story about the landscape of New England is that basically every forest you've ever been in New England was cleared for agricultural land sometime in the last couple hundred years. And much of it actually was maintained as agricultural land for a century or more. It's hard to understand until you really know what to look for. But then you go out in forest and you see that basically every forest on our landscape carries the legacies of agricultural use. So it's not as simple as, all the trees are little. It's not as simple as like, you just see like, I don't know what, cow skeletons everywhere. The way that forests regrow from this is itself indicative of that. So a lot of these forests I'll talk about a little bit later are highly even aged. So which means that all the trees are about the same age, and the age of those trees is equal to the number of years ago that it was a pasture. And let's compare that again to our old growth forests, which were highly uneven aged with that structural complexity, that vertical structural diversity. It's totally different. And the story also goes that this is why. So it's a little bit more complex than this. But this is a merino sheep. And basically what happened is that following Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808, merino sheep were imported to Vermont, actually. That there was this guy, William Jarvis, who was the United States consul to Portugal. And this sheep had been like the prize sheep of King of Spain. And you weren't able to like export them at all. And then suddenly you were. And suddenly this wool was worth like 5 times as much as the wool of any other sheep. And it was really a gold rush. And one thing that's interesting about sheep is that they can graze absolutely anywhere. And so, you know, even these really steep areas, there's an area here on my land, which I call Bear Island, area here at Bear Island, which is so steep that when I walk on it, I like have to put one hand on the ground. You know, it's that steep. And I have aerial photos from the 1930s, and it was all pasture. I mean, it'll just blow your mind. And, you know, sometimes you'll be walking through the woods, really remote, really steep, rocky, thin soils, and then you'll find like a cellar hole or something from an old house. It's amazing. So, yeah, so I mean, I think while we think that probably we never had less than somewhere between 20 and 40% forest cover on the landscape at a given time, you know, that 40% would have fluctuated. So that doesn't mean that today we have like 20 to 40% old growth forests. That just means that it was in a process of being continuously cleared all the time for centuries. This is the last catamount eastern cougar that was shot in 1881 in Barnard, Vermont, declared extinct in 2018. And this was just, I've already talked about this, but this is just my reminder to talk to you about all these species that were lost during the 1700s, which is, again, not me trying to depress you, but just to like impart to you how much things have changed. So in the 1700s and the 1800s, we lost the beaver, the turkey, the fisher, the moose, the caribou, the elk, catamount, wolves, bear, otter, Canada geese, marten, passenger pigeons, and others. That story about the merino sheep, which is what I was taught in school growing up in Vermont, I think it does hide a little bit of complexity, because at the same time that there was like all of the settler colonialism and all of this agricultural use and clearing all these lands for pasture, there was also a massive amount of exploitation that was going on for timber. So one of the things that, you know, this wasn't a big source of exploitation here, but in certain parts of the country, like Maine, fence posts at a certain point became like a kind of currency, because you can imagine you clear all your forests. At that time, people were mostly not using stones for stone walls. They were using wooden fences, split rail fences. And so suddenly you cleared all the forest. There's nowhere to cut your fence rails anymore, right? And so people were really, really, really tending these forests really hard. And people are also using coal for everything. Railroads are being powered on wood, you know, all of these different uses, smelting, all this stuff. You got to also know that in the 1800s, so I think the invention of the wood stove was around 1860. Prior, and it wasn't, you know, there was an uptick of that until a little bit later. Prior to the advent of the wood stove, a normal home would burn like 40 plus cords of wood a year just for heating in a little home, you know, because they were heating with fireplaces, which is really, really inefficient. By the mid 1800s, trains, steamboats were all using wood. All the railroads in the US were using 7 million cords a year. Railroad ties were also a big user of wood, about 30 million cords a year. The craziest, if you want a rundown of all of this like historical stuff, the best book is this book called American Canopy by Eric Rutko. And I think that's Rutkow. And he talks about how every year for the railroads, just for railroad ties, right, they needed the approximately the wood just to repair, not to make any new sections of railroad, just to repair existing sections. they needed the equivalent of clear cutting about 150,000 acres a year, which is pretty crazy. There's another book that's actually from down around where you are called A Reverence for Wood, which is by Eric Sloan, where he talks a lot about the demand for coal and how sometimes these forests would be grown, they would grow small trees on like 30-year rotations and then clear cut them for coal production. And they called that, when a young forest like that got clear cut, they said it got cold. This grainy picture with some text on it that's not supposed to be there is my reminder to tell you that there is a really interesting thing that you think about. Like, we go into our forests and maybe we find a cellar hole or a stone wall or something, and we're like, oh, this is some nuance of history. And sometimes we forget that, like, a lot of these homesteads, that's not where people lived like for a second. Like, that's the place where people, European people, might have lived for a century, right? It might have been a place where someone at some point could have said that they and their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their great-great-grandparents all only knew this land as like a giant pasture and only knew that, you know, their forest was, or their house was standing right there. It's pretty amazing to think about, right? And especially the early 1900s, what we see is this period of regrowth. And a lot of these areas that had been managed for agricultural land for 100 years plus, returning to forest land. From a perspective of wildlife, the 1900s is like the lowest point, and when there have probably ever in any amount of history that we can even really think about, the lowest amount of basically every species on our landscape. So this is the period of time when white-tailed deer was almost extinct, elk was almost extinct, including in the West. Black bears were almost extinct, beaver were almost extinct, otters were almost extinct. All of these birds were almost extinct from what they call plume hunting for these feathers for people's hats. I mean, it was really bad. And then we had some just sort of like cultural changes with wildlife. The thing that really benefited them was this act called the Lacey Act of 1900, which effectively prohibited market hunting. So you couldn't just go out there and kill 200 bison and, you know, and just like take their hides off and go and sell them. It made it so that hunting for money, which people were, you know, doing it at a very large scale, was not as easy to do. And that's when we saw a lot of species come back. And a lot of species that were reintroduced as well. So this is an old grainy picture of the beaver reintroductions of the 1930s. Most species that we have reintroduced on the landscape, and this includes white-tailed deer, except in a couple notable occurrences, including in Vermont, where they were reintroduced in the late 1800s. Most were reintroduced after 1937. 1937 was when there was another foundational piece of wildlife legislation that's called the Pittman-Robertson Act, which took this existing 11% tax on firearms and created this pot of money that folks could use for wildlife and habitat restoration. In the case of white-tailed deer, where again, basically every white-tailed deer in the eastern United States is the descendant of a reintroduced population or has a lot of reintroduced genes in it, 100,000 of the 105,000 total deer that were reintroduced throughout the 1900s were reintroduced after 1937. So beavers were reintroduced, really, really cool. And then they could start sort of like recreating some of those habitats that have been lost across this landscape. Out west, by the way, this is a process that is only happening now. There's actually some like contention about if beavers were native to a lot of these areas of the West where they are. And they're just getting these beaver back now, you know, whatever, 300 years after they were extirpated. This cutie is a fisher. It's one of our larger mustelids. The second largest mustelid in most areas after otter. And fisher was also reintroduced in Vermont and in some other areas in the 1960s. I'm not sure if Massachusetts is on that list or not. And it was introduced primarily because it had been extirpated. It's a weasel, a mustelid. So all the weasels are fur bearers, and most of all of them were trapped out for their pelts. And we had this massive porcupine problem where there was a bounty on porcupines in Vermont and in New Hampshire and in Maine. In Vermont, you turned in a pair of their ears. In New Hampshire, I think it was their nose, and in Maine, it was their paws, and collected the bounty because without their one native predator, which is the fisher, they just went wild. And they were just like eating people's houses, eating people's shoes. I have a clipping from the early 1900s from the Green Mountain Club, which is the organization that maintained this statewide, state-long trail that we have called the Long Trail. And they have instructions on like how to kill a porcupine when you encounter them in the shelters. And also that if you don't take your shoes to bed with you, they will be gone in the morning because the porcupines will eat them. They'll eat anything with salt. Loggers have to put electric fences around their skidders or else the porcupines would chew on the hydraulic hoses. It was really bad. And the fishers have been really successful in actually reducing those porcupine populations. So there's actually, we think about wildlife introductions of things like bison and wolves out west, but there's actually been a lot of earlier wildlife introductions that have been very, very successful in the east. So one of the interesting things about the forests that we have today is that so many of them are the product not just of their ecology, the way that they've been growing for thousands of years, but in fact of these weird nuances of human history. So every time in the history of New England, when we had a moment when like a big cultural change happened, we got like a whole bunch of forests. So we had this happen around 1900. We had this happen around the 1930s with like westward expansion and the Great Depression, when all these farms went out of business, all these people went west and all of their fields grew back up into forests. A big moment for a lot of states is around the 1960s. In Vermont, this was 1955, when these new food safety laws were put into place that required dairy farms. Many of these farms had now transitioned from wool to milk, to have like a refrigerated bulk milk tank and to be able to get a milk truck to their farm and have some other stuff. And most of these dairies were very, very small. And so they couldn't afford it. And so all of their pastures went back to forest. And we have a huge amount of forests in Vermont that, you know, are now 60 years old. And they come from that decade between 1955 and 1965, when 2/3 of the dairies in Vermont went out of business, not because of anything that important happened ecologically, but just because of a law that was passed. Which brings us to like what our forests are like today. So this is an example of a forest that we have today that is even aged. So again, one of the cool things that I'm really interested in about old growth forests is not just protecting old growth forests because they're old, because it's this like artifact, but they tell us things about what forests have looked like on this landscape for thousands of years. And the conditions that we find in old growth forests, for the most part, and this we'll go to when I'll talk about fire briefly later, which is a little bit different. The conditions that we find in old growth forest are the conditions that all of our native species are adapted to. So when we see in an old growth forest, we have these multi-generational, structurally complex forest, and there's big trees and old trees, dead wood on the ground, dead standing trees. And in our modern forest, we have none of those things, right? We just have a single generation of trees, often tree species that happen to be good at growing in an old field like white pine, and they're missing all of those attributes. And those missing attributes are not just important from like a historical preservation perspective. Those things actually provide habitats that allow our biodiversity to live there. And they also do things like, you know, benefit us another way by cleaning our air and cleaning our water and building soil and storing carbon and doing all these other things that forests do for us. So when I walk through a forest, I think I'm not very much fun to walk with, because everybody else will be like, oh, this beautiful forest. And I see not just what is beautiful about it, but also what is missing. And it brings me to this idea that I think is really important that we think about, which is like, what even is a forest? What are we trying to protect? You know, and I think that a lot of times we get confused because the most defining attribute of forests is the trees. There are these trees that, you know, they're just big hard plants, I call them. These amazing organisms that are like the coral in the coral reef of this forest. They're this living structure around which this community is built. But a forest, by any measure beyond, what it looks like, a forest is so much more than just trees, right? A forest is all of these living things, this entire biotic community, which it actually can't live without. I used to think of this concept of biodiversity as being like an ornament, that you hang on the forest. It's a thing that's nice to have, when really it's actually essential. The currency of our forest, all of these organisms that together create this community that actually create the conditions that allow trees to exist. So doing things like regulating pest populations and pollinators and building soil and navigating all these complex trophic webs, these food webs, food chain that sustain this ecosystem. So when I think about a forest and when I refer to a forest, I'm not referring to these trees. I'm referring to these trees and actually all of the living things that inhabit this ecosystem. I'm referring to things that we'd often think of as non-living things like soils and waters. I'm referring to even the natural processes that change this forest over time, which are equally essential to the trees that are actually standing there. Things like tree mortality, which, while to us it's a nuisance and it makes us sad and all these things, to literally thousands of species of organisms in our forest, it's a boon. It's where they've lived for thousands of years. This community of organisms that we call the necrosphere, bacteria and fungi and salamanders and all of these different amazing things that not just get to live in our forest, but also do things like break down wood, do this process of nutrient cycling, which allows future generations of trees to grow. So in addition to sort of like deepening and expanding our idea of what a forest is, it's also really important that we understand the volume of threats that forests face. So, right, we have these forests which are in recovery in many cases, which are like, coming back from being really cleared and missing all of these really important attributes. And they've had species taken away from them and they've had new species introduced and this just big jumbled mess. And then at the same time that they're sort of in recovery, they're dealing with this incredible volume of threats and stressors that we refer to as global change. And you'll see this term global change more and more in the literature, the research. Sometimes you'll hear something referred to as global change biology. What global change is it's a term that's meant to encapsulate all of the threats and stressors that forests and other ecosystems are dealing with at this moment. So it is climate change, and it is also deer overpopulation. It's also introduced animals, plants, pests, and pathogens. It's also deforestation, forest fragmentation, pollution, all of these different things that are affecting forests at once. The legacies of this past land use, right? And all the things that means for our forests. The impact of the loss of these different species that have been lost from our forests. All that stuff, we pack it together and we call it global change. And it's important that we recognize that any one of those things, any one, would be enough to fundamentally threaten the ability of our forests to be healthy, right? And cause all of these problems, destabilize them, prevent them from being as they've been on this landscape for thousands of years. And right now, forests are dealing with all of those things at once. And so it's really important when we understand, as much as we know that forests are resilient and as much as we know that they're so good at regenerating and responding to disturbance with abundance, we also need to understand that there's a point at which it's beyond their capacity for resilience, and we might need to give them a hand. These are a few of the things that we think about. It's hard to say which is, no, it's not. I know which one is worse. They're all bad. So what I'm depicting here is what's on my right, maybe that's on your left, I don't know, is introduced plants. So this is a big area, honeysuckle and buckthorn. Introduced plants are just these species that we brought here that happen to have this suite of traits that make them hyper-virulent, hyper-competitive, spread really easily, really hard to kill. And what they do is they displace our native species, and in so doing, disrupt forest natural developmental processes such that when a tree dies, instead of getting this flush of native regeneration and all of these new species, these new plants and shrubs and trees that provide habitat for these insects, that provide food for these birds, we get this monoculture of an introduced species that none of our native species have any evolutionary history with. They don't know what to do with it. And it disrupts forests really, really vital natural processes, regeneration, and they do other stuff as well. That's a little nefarious. Deer overpopulation, massive problem. I've been now all over the country, and I can't tell you how lucky we are here in the Northeast to have as low of a deer overpopulation as we do. There are many places in the country where their deer population, which we think maybe our landscape can sustain like 20 deer per square mile, well over 100 is normal. 200, 350 is the highest that I've seen outside of Philadelphia. But both of those things pale in comparison to that last circle, which is what I'm characterizing as deforestation. So the funny thing about it is, like, as much as we want to do all this stuff within our forests, we are losing in each state in New England thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of forest land every single year to deforestation. And that's forest that doesn't come back. And so I know it's, it can be like, we want to protect the forest that we have. We want to, people want to have this discussion about forest management on public lands. We should really be focusing on forests that are at risk of deforestation on private lands, because that's where we're actually losing forests forever. And that never comes back. And if we can't keep a forest as a forest, it'll never provide habitat. It'll never provide, clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration and storage, any of those things again. It's just gone. And so it's really, really important that we take that seriously. And a lot of times, the way that we do that is the very, very sexy process of community planning and just being involved in your town and helping them make smart development restrictions that does things like concentrates development in already developed areas, limits things like big long driveways, which are the absolute worst, and installs better protections on undeveloped areas. This is a new thing for me. So this is a depiction of the Great Plains and this whole wave of eastern red cedar, a native species, marching across it. So if you go out west to the prairies, the plains states, they depict this, or they describe this as the Green Glacier. And what the Green Glacier is what happens when a fire-adapted ecosystem doesn't burn anymore and it becomes a forest. And it creates this really weird situation where we love forests, and we're like, oh, we love forests, we want all these forests, when actually that forest is standing on the site of where should be a globally important ecosystem, a tall grass prairie, a short grass prairie, a savanna, an oak woodland, many of these open canopy oak systems. And what's happened is that for thousands of years, these grassland ecosystems have been sustained not by, just nature taking its course, but by especially anthropogenic fire, indigenous fire, and natural fire. And now the natural fires are put out. The indigenous fire is gone as indigenous people have been driven off their land. And so what we have is when these grasslands don't burn, we get this wave of red cedar. And turning into a forest, in this case, though we love forest, is exactly what we want not to happen. And so it's a really interesting thing. It was like sort of like twisted my mind when I thought about it as I was on the edge of the prairie. I was just in Minnesota. And then last year I was in Indiana and Kentucky to realize that, I mentioned that these old growth forests are these sort of like undisturbed forests. In these grassland environments, an old growth ecosystem is an extremely anthropogenic ecosystem. And it's an example of when actually, if it's not managed, if it's not burned, it goes away and no longer is a good representation of that old growth system. So it's a very, very interesting thing. When I started this process and the book came out and I started to tour all over the place, I thought that I understood forests perfectly. Right? I thought I knew everything about them. And now what I realized is that I just understood forests in this like little part of the world in Vermont. And there are many similar themes, but like forests everywhere are really different. And the one thing that we don't have in Vermont that is like the thing that ecosystems need, and the thing that ecosystem managers talk to me about everywhere I go in this whole country, is that they need to burn. And this is true for, parts of, southern New Hampshire. This is true for coastal Maine. This is true for coastal New England. This is true for basically everywhere south of that, is that fire is this vast missing thing from these ecosystems that are really preventing them from being as they were historically. And some of these fire-dependent open canopy systems like tallgrass prairie and oak savannas have been like 99% lost because of the absence of fire. I don't really have time to talk to you about this, but I have this whole story to tell about my land, Bear Island. And the thing that's been so cool, I'm actually on it right now. It's right behind me, back there. It's this 175-acre forest that I bought in 2017. And I had this experience on it, which is really common to all of us, whether we own a forest or whether or not, which is that you get there and you don't get to choose what happened before. You get there and you're like, well, here is the forest that we have. What am I going to do about it? And we spend all this time being so upset about how things got to be the way that they are and how it's so unfair, and all these people in the past made all these choices that now made us not have good choices and all that stuff. And none of that matters. And so, you can have your little pity party and then be like, okay, so now what are we going to do about it? And really my story is, how do we use ecosystem stewardship, in a different way than past generations have? Like, how do we think about our role as stewards of this ecosystem, not as a means to make ecosystems into whatever we want them to be and dominate them and exploit them and degrade them? How do we recognize that in this moment, they need our help to be themselves, right? That regardless of who did it or why it happened, all this stuff happened. And now, if we want to live in a world of these beautiful, abundant, thriving ecosystems, there's stuff we got to do. And the story that I tell about Bear Island is that a lot of those things weren't things that we would ever think about as being something that would be how we love a forest or care for a forest. They were doing things like cutting a tree, and I love trees the most. And, figuring out how we use these tools at our disposal that, yes, can be used to degrade ecosystems like a chainsaw, to also help them heal. And I think that if we can get over sort of like our shared trauma over what happened and how it happened and why it happened, we will realize that there's actually a lot of good that can be done here, and that we actually have these tools that can help ecosystems heal. And today, I really think of Bear Island not as as I did when I got there, a forest with every problem that a forest could have, worst forest in the world, but as a symbol of what's possible and a symbol of hope. There's this word that I love called stewardship, I should say. Forest stewardship is one part of it. Stewardship is an amazing word, and I sort of think about it in relation to the word management. So we think about forest management, and really what management is, in a traditional sense, is like we go into these ecosystems and we just do this one thing, and this one intervention, and then we sort of that's it. And really what we need to do with our ecosystems is not just management, but stewardship, which is a concept that encompasses management, but also involves this sort of ongoing process. There's a couple different words a couple different reasons that I really love this word. One is that it implies a temporariness. So we are the stewards of these ecosystems, of this landscape, of these communities, just for a moment in time. And then at some point, we pass them on to future generations, and I think it's our responsibility to give future generations a world that's more abundant and more full of life than the world of today. And there's another thing that I like about it, which is that it's a process. And I think that if we expect that we can just go into a forest every 20 years and we'll just do one thing, and then we'll check in another 20 years and everything will be good, I think that's, it might work in some forests, but it's certainly not a good expectation to have that's probably going to be successful. What we really need to do is understand that this is a never-ending process. that actually will never be done. And that's okay, right? And in the same way that will never be done building our communities, right? It'll always be something that's in process, and that's totally fine. That means it's working. I had this realization here at Bear Island. I have this little orchard. I've just been planting a few trees from this awesome company in Maine called Fedco. Weird heirloom apple varieties and stuff. Names I never heard of. And just a few trees a year. And now I got 100 apple trees. And every year I've been doing the work, and like, you prune them and you weed them and you water them and you mulch them and you fertilize them and train them and all this different stuff. And every year they get bigger. And I had this realization a couple of years ago as I was tending to my apple trees, and I was like, oh, planting the tree was the easiest part, right? That actually we think that, we just get to do this one big thing, plant this tree, and we feel so good and we walk away. But actually the really radical thing is not putting that tree in the ground, but to tend the trees that we've planted. And that's when it really requires us to dig deep, right? And to really engage with this process of what this forest mean to us. And as I've learned at Bear Island, dealing with all these different problems, these introduced plant species and this deer overpopulation and these legacies of how this land has been managed in this really short-sighted way in the past, it's not a straight line. And you got to know that you're going to try stuff and you're going to fail, and you're try again and do your best. And that to me is not, expression of we're doing anything wrong. That's what it means to be a forest steward. All right. So last thing I'll tell you is that I do have this book. I am really proud of it. It is an honor to get to share it with you. It's called How to Love a Forest. And with that said, I would love to take some of your questions. I'm going to make you look at this bird, chimney swift, barn swallow. And I would love to take some of your questions. So if you have them, please do drop them in the chat. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, if you put them in the Q&A, that would
The
be
Q&A.
probably
Q&A. Yep, the chat is not open.
Chat is not going to work.
Thank you so much, Ethan. And Henry, I don't know if you want to ask a couple questions. I see one question entered in, but please, folks, feel free to type in your other questions, and we'll get to those
while
too.
people are doing that, let me just ask if there are any general kind of active steps that somebody who owns, say, 10 to 50 acres of woodland
100%. Yeah.
can take soon
Sure.
in terms of playing a role in trying to deal with changes that are going to happen in terms of global climate and global change. And then what do you do with the diseases and pests? Do you prophylactically go through and remove diseases and pests? Any tree that's diseased, do you remove it, or do you let them be in hopes that you can discover what the resistant trees are?
So I'm gonna tell you the most important and frustrating phrase in forest stewardship, which is it depends. Right? So like this is one of the things, like that stewardship process, you gotta get comfortable with the idea that there isn't a right answer for a lot of these things, that there are highly variable conditions and changing conditions with respect to all this different stuff. But with respect to your first question, I would say the best thing that anybody could do when they don't know what to do would be to call your local service forester, or another person who's just like a public resource. Sometimes there are biologists that do this in your area. Everybody in the East, I think, should have a service forester that can just come out and take a walk with you for free and give you advice. And the thing about that, so I did that. I was in Vermont, we call them county foresters. In Vermont, I was the Chittenden County forester for 8 years. And it was the best, because you would just like go out to these forests, and people, you don't have to know anything about a forest to be the owner of one. Some people just bought it because it seemed cool. And and then you get to like take all of this sort of just like undifferentiated concern and excitement and all this stuff and just ground it in reality. I called it the triage, where you'd go there and be like, this is the most important thing you can do, right? Or they would ask you, is this appropriate? And you'd be like, yes. Or you'd be like, no. And you'd like point them in the right direction and get them hooked up with, mentorship opportunities and all of these other things. I just think that it's pretty, I think we forget when, I spend so much time in the forest that I just see stuff that other people don't see. And if you can have someone like that come out to your woods, that's the most important thing. The other thing that I would say, I have this experience now of being like all over the country, like way out of my wheelhouse in terms of stuff that I know about. Have people ask me like, what do I do right here? And I'm like, well, here are the bigger concepts, but there are people like me, who are the experts in this one little ecosystems in this one little area where you are. And they've probably been waiting to hear from you. They've been out there, conservation organizations, government agencies, NGOs, volunteer groups, citizen groups, all these different things. And they've been putting out videos and they've been holding events and they've been doing walks and talks and book clubs and social media and email lists and all these different stuff. And when I was part of that community, as the county forester, we were always like, how come we can't get nobody to come to our events or like, read our resources or watch our videos and all these things. And they're out there, I promise you. And there's someone who knows everything about the ecosystems where you are that can help kind of like cut through that static for you. So I would say, find out who those conservation orgs are, sign up to their email list. So Mass Forest Alliance is one of them. Sign up to their email list, go to their events, get their e-news and be active. And you're going to learn so much.
Okay. Let me just ask a question that came in the Q&A, and I'm going to paraphrase it. One of the missions of the Woodlands Partnership is to try to revitalize the wood-based economy in a sustainable fashion that will be enduring so that future generations can benefit from healthy, productive, diverse forests that are doing their thing.
Mm.
And the question is the decline in our forest industries, particularly in kind of Northwest Massachusetts, which used to have dozens of small family-owned sawmills, and fairly light impact, can't compete with Canada now because most of or much of our forests that are trees that are being cut get shipped up to Canada, go through sawmills. And ironically, we are dependent upon imports of wood in a region that is highly forested and highly productive in that regard. So, what do you see the role of forest industries in terms of not just cutting the trees down, but actually
Yeah.
manufacturing forest products as
Mm.
part of the sustainability issue?
So I think that wood is like one of the best resources imaginable. Truly, So if we were thinking about like where stuff comes from, and so it's a resource that can be produced at no cost that can replace incredibly carbon intensive materials like steel, concrete, plastic. That's renewable. We make it here. We can take it out of living systems while, a full range of habitats and ecosystem processes remain intact, which is, by the way, not something that we can say for agriculture. And we can even do it if we're doing it in the right way. We can even do it while helping ecosystems heal and creating habitat for species of concern and making forests more climate resilient and doing all this stuff. So like, I think that one of the things that we're doing sort of like as an environmentalism, conservationism community or conservationist community is updating our understanding of like what logging is, right? So there's a whole generations of people who are just like logging's bad, it's totally extractive, it's totally harmful, and you can see what that looks like if you go to the south or if you go to the west, where it's like really intensive management, which is not what we're doing here. And I really have realized that if we were to do visioning, like let's vision what we want our world to look like in 20 years, and not just like, this rosy vision, but like actually think about it and think about how we want to live in a world where we have like abundant resources to consume. And what do we want those to be? Like, what do you want to make stuff out of? You want to make it out of plastic? Or do you want to make it out of a resource that we can harvest here, that we can make sure it's being done well, that's going to employ our neighbors and create these local economic opportunities and be renewable and be beautiful? Like, it's hard to imagine a better resource than wood. And I actually had a real eye-opening moment, and now I've seen it repeated all over the country. But the first time I went to New Jersey to do a talk, I was speaking at this forestry conference, and the first thing that all the foresters told me is like, we have like no forest products industry here. So we have no mills, no markets, no loggers, no truckers. Can't do what we call commercial forest management. So commercial forest management is often misunderstood to mean management where you're just treating a forest like it's a cornfield and take out like it's your bank account. Commercial forest management is just any forest management where wood is also being like sold. So that doesn't mean that that's the main goal of the management. It just means that we're also selling wood. So they didn't have that option in New Jersey. And the result of it was that they just weren't doing work at scale, period. They had all of these species of concern. They had all of this ecosystem restoration they wanted to do. They had all this like fire mitigation in the pine barrens that they wanted to do. And the only work that was getting done was work that could either be paid for by an NRCS grant, which is extremely limited and difficult to get through, or that landowners were funding out of pocket. So if you're a landowner and you want to create some habitat for the golden winged warbler, bird species of concern, we're trying to keep off the endangered species list, you can, pay somebody $10,000 an acre, and you're like, well, geez, I guess I'll do 1 acre. Or we could do that same project over hundreds of acres, right? Or dozens of acres or whatever. And we could be generating local renewable resources and generating income that could then get reinvested into like, all of these like invasive plant control and all these, planting climate adapted tree species, all these other cool stuff. And that's when I really realized like what a gift it is to have the ability to do this work commercially. When I do forest management work, I work with loggers all the time. I sell wood all the time. And my biggest goal for every forest that I manage is that I'm restoring these old growth conditions. So I'm actually taking these younger forests, managing them like a windstorm to try and create these properties of structural diversity, and multi-generationality, putting dead wood on the ground, putting gaps in the canopy. And we're pulling trees out, and, it allows us to do this work at an incredible scale. And I think an important thing for us to remember with all that stuff is that we put all of this philosophical stuff onto forests, and that's really just about us. Like the salamander that has habitat because I cut a tree and put it on the ground when it was an even age forest and there hasn't been wood on the ground for 200 years. It doesn't care if I cut that tree down or if it fell over on its own.
Right.
Right. So
Okay.
I just want to finish this thought, Hank, quickly. That I have experienced this loss of these forest products industries across the country. I was just in Asheville, North Carolina, doing some events. They just had this massive blowdown from Hurricane Helene, where the fact they were like, oh shoot, the fact that this pulp mill closed, right, means that we can't do any storm cleanup. That all of the wood that they're cutting to like open their roads and clean around their houses and deal with hazards is getting landfilled. It's getting put in a landfill. And it was just another time when I was like, oh man, it really, these these industries that produce local renewable resources, and we can have a discussion all day long about how they do that and the right way to do that, but they are so important for so many different reasons, which even go beyond just our ability to like produce wood, right? It's about so much other stuff. It's about our landscape level resilience, and it's about providing habitat, and it's really a gift that I think is a resource that we want to be more supportive of.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about invasive exotics such as buckthorn and bittersweet.
Mm, hmm.
What do you do with that?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. And I would say that if you have them, that is your starting place. That's the first thing you deal with, because basically nothing else that you want to do to create cool habitats and do all this other stuff is going to work if you don't deal with that. Just because they're so aggressive, right? They're the wolf in the proverbial henhouse. They are this novel species that just is dropped in here, and none of our native species have any evolutionary history with them, ability to compete with them, etc. But here's the tough thing. And I actually have this is such a nuanced issue that I have a whole chapter in my book about it, which I wish I could just read to you right now, but I'll give you the cliff notes, which is that they're almost impossible to kill without herbicide. And that's, for a lot of us that care about ecosystems, we were raised like me, raised not thinking herbicide was part of our world. That sounds crazy. But there are actually herbicides that can be used in this really thoughtful, really minimal way, which is not as scary as it sounds. And, is actually what has been done by so many people, conservation organizations, NGOs that care about ecosystems. And I figured out, answer these questions like, what's worse, the herbicides or the invasives? The invasives are worse in terms of the existential threat that they pose to these ecosystems and how they disrupt their natural processes. And, can it be applied in a way that's safe to our soils, our waters, our biodiversity? And the answer is yes. It's really, really nuanced, and it's really, really weird, but actually used in the right way, it is absolutely life-changing. Truly, not just for me, but also for these forests, because it actually allows us to deal with this problem. And in lieu of that, what I find people do is that they just try and then they fail, because I've seen, and this is not a joke, as county forester, I've seen hundreds of attempts, and there is a weird Venn diagram where people who understand the threat of these invasive plants, care about ecosystems enough to want to do something about it, are also the same people who also don't want to use herbicide. I've seen hundreds of people attempt to use it, or attempt to not use it and control invasive plants. And I have crunched the numbers, and I can tell you what the success rate is. It's 0. No successful attempts. And so what folks often do instead is they try, they fail, and then they develop all of these really elaborate philosophies about why we shouldn't have to do it. And again, none of these species, none of these 60,000 native species that live here, millions or billions of which may be in a handful of soil, and all of these trees and all of these critters and all these birds care what your philosophy is. They just want to live, and I think it's honestly the least we can do.
Okay. Question about what your thoughts about deforestation being caused by solar farms.
I haven't seen that myself. I've heard about it. And yeah, I think it's such a, if that is happening to the extent that it's happening, and again, I haven't crunched the numbers, I haven't run the research on it. I've just heard about anecdotally that it happens sometimes. That's silly. And we need solar, but there are better places to put it. And the concept of cutting down a forest, which, by the way, that a forest is a solar panel, right? And it's a solar panel that's just made of wood and does that. We have all these high-tech solutions, and here's this low-tech thing that just grows there out of the ground. We shouldn't be cutting down forests for that. That's crazy. And there's a lot of other better places. Agricultural land is a better place for it, but even better than that is places like parking lots, rooftops, landfills, stuff like that should be where solar is deployed. And so I do think if people are seeing that really happening on the landscape, like we have to advocate for rules that are going to change that.
Okay, for the protection of watershed and wildlife forested corridors, what is your thoughts on the percent of structure builds versus the percent of forest left intact? Is there a ratio you like to use?
The structure what?
Percent of structure builds, it says here.
Oh, maybe just like the work that I'm doing to build forest structure.
Right. I
So I
guess
would say
versus
that
just leaving it intact.
well, yeah. So I think that word intact is a little tricky because for a forest to be multi-generational like that is for it to be intact, right? Like
Right.
this, what we consider to be intact is just a forest that we haven't managed in a little while. Um, or in a very rare case, it might be like a real old growth forest, but probably not because those are like 1/10 of 1% to 1/2 of 1% of our forests. So yeah, so what I would say is we need to like shift the narrative a little bit. I think that the word intact is sometimes used to mean unmanaged forest, but again, for every species that actually lives in a forest and has lived here for thousands of years, that forest that may have been, yes, managed by people, but has those qualities like is structurally diverse, is multi-generational, has dead wood on the ground, has gaps in the canopy, has some big trees. That's more intact to every living thing that lives here than a forest that doesn't have those things.
What do you say to people who feel the best thing to do for forests is not to touch them at all, but to leave them alone? How can you be convincing in making arguments
Well, so
in
I
that
would
regard?
say that those people are right sometimes, just not all the time. It's funny. Like I think that there's this idea that there's over here these people who just like they just want to manage the forest like it's their bank account, and over here is people who just never want to manage it at all. And it's like that the old proverb where they're like both touching a little bit of the elephant, and they like one of them touches the trunk and it's like, oh, an elephant. Was it the blind men maybe? One of them touches the trunk and it's like, oh, an elephant is like a rope, and one of them touches like the leg and they're like, an elephant's like a tree. Um, there are some cases where like leaving a forest alone is a great thing to do, you know? And I actually have had times when I've like people have read my book, which a lot of it is like advocating for wrapping our head around like doing stuff, doing management. Went to walk with this person and at the end of it, I was like, nah, this is good. I can't think of a way that we could improve this, and no big glaring issues, nothing preventing that forest from being healthy and happy. And it already developed all of these cool qualities. And I was like, nah, this is good. And they were like, wait, but I thought you were like the action guy. And I was like, sometimes, but anybody who tells you that they have the answer for every forest is wrong.
Okay.
And so what I would say is that we think about the way that people think about this is, I think, where we need to be careful is that the way that people think about not managing a forest is that if we don't manage a forest, that we don't do anything wrong, which is also not true, right? That there are cases when, because of the stuff that these forests are dealing with, when not managing a forest is incredibly irresponsible. And there are cases when managing a forest would be irresponsible. And there are cases when more than one thing can be true, right? There are cases when you could go into a forest and you would go, I don't know, like you could make a case for either thing here. And by the way, it isn't like we're trying to solve this problem in terms of like there's one right answer and we're just trying to suss it out what it is. Actually, what we want on this landscape is, again, this diverse mosaic of different conditions. But we want to be really careful about what we do where. So in the same way that we wouldn't, want to go and do forest management in some like really sensitive, cool, unique system, we would not want to not do management in a system that's heavily invaded with invasive plants or dealing with all of these Like on my forest, I read about this beech bark disease thing, this novel disease that's totally changed the shape of this entire ecosystem, and it gets kind of stuck. And there's a bunch of different other cases like that. So
Right.
we just need to not think about anything like it's a panacea. We need to understand that, it depends. Again,
Okay.
that important phrase.
One says, awesome. Thank you, Ethan. When you said long driveways are terrible, why is that?
So the reason why it's terrible, and by the way, I just came from the land of long driveways. You want to go see some long driveways? Go to Asheville, North Carolina. My God, every ridge top covered in houses, house built on stilts and stuff. It's crazy. Um, so what happens is forests are healthy, like in aggregate, and what we really want for forest health broadly, and this is inclusive of biodiversity. We need these big intact forest blocks, which are not split up by driveways, like commercial, like roads, and houses. And so this thing happens to our landscape where, one person perfectly innocently just says like, I bought this piece of land. There's, way up at the top of the ridge, there's a nice flat spot with a good view. And that just seems like a nice place to build a house. And so they go and do it. And it's a perfectly innocent thing. And, they're not an evil person or anything like that. And then another person does it. And then another person does it. And then another person does it. And then eventually it's like the death by a thousand cuts. Our forest blocks get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. They become suitable for fewer and fewer and fewer of our animals. They start to have all of these things called edge effects, which is where the plant composition and the animal composition and these other effects emanate from those edges into the forest and really, really change what's going on there. And if you fly in a plane, you can see this. I mean, one of the if I were to tell you, like, if you were like, what's one rule that we could do to like really protect forests in your community? The first one would be like no deforestation allowed. And the second one would be limit the driveway length.
So what do
We
you
need
mean
to
by deforestation? You mean clear cutting? Or
no,
what do
no,
you
deforestation is the permanent conversion of forest land to a non-forest use. Clear cutting is not deforestation.
Okay,
Unless following that clear cutting gets turned into a parking lot.
right.
So, but what I'm saying is, other than that, other than saying you can't take a forest and make it into a parking lot, what you could do is just say your driveways can only be this long. And what that will do is help us really, we need to be concentrating development around already fragmented features like village centers especially, but even just putting the houses right next to the road goes a long way. And as much as we want that long driveway to get up to that place with a nice view, we can't afford it
Right.
because of the way that it fragments the landscape.
Yeah. Well, in areas with a lot of snowfall, long driveways can be really problematic for
Yeah, it's
5 months a
yeah,
year.
you would become like a driveway person for the rest of your life anyway. Why would you want
Right.
to do that?
Okay. And one last question, which you probably have answered in part by
Ooh,
saying get an appointment with your service forester and
yeah.
walk your land. But the question was, where do we start? We own a 120-acre farm in Clarksburg, Massachusetts, that has beautiful forests covering 90% of our land. I have a few questions. What signs tell you our forest is thriving versus struggling? What are, the invasive species I should be watching out for?
Mm.
And what is the most overlooked opportunity in the Berkshire forests? And she would say, what would you do in the next 1 to 3 years? She knows
I
you're
would have a
not
service
familiar
forester
with the
come out.
property, but other than talking
Yeah.
with a service forester, where do you go?
Um, hmm. I mean, I think, invasive plants are always the priority. Basically, I would say even if you want to basically do no management in the canopy, like cutting no trees, you still need to manage invasive plants. because even with natural mortality, the forest's ability to respond to natural mortality, it will be ultimately derailed by those invasive plants. The ones that, where we are, the ones that you need to look out for are common buckthorn, glossy buckthorn, shrub honeysuckle, multiflora rose, Asiatic bittersweet. What am I missing, Hank? Japanese barberry, of
Yeah.
course.
Japanese
Those would be
knotweed.
the ones
Yeah.
to start. So those ones, and you can get this app on your phone that's called Seek, and it'll tell you what stuff is. And so what you're going to do, you're going to go around, you're going to look for those plants. If you don't have time to get with a forester just yet, go around, look for those plants, and develop an eye for them, and see where they are. Right now is actually a really, really good time to be spending a lot of time in your woods, because with phenology, the way that the timing of when trees like leaf out and stuff, that all of these introduced plants will be leafing out way sooner than all of the native stuff. And so right now, if you're not sure if they're there, you can like walk around, and if you see this like green haze of this shrubbiness in the understory, that's almost certainly going to be one of these introduced plants. And so it can actually be like, when I used to walk with landowners, it was a really eye-opening time to walk in the woods with them, because it's like, oh my god, oh my goodness, you can see this cloud, and you can also be like, there they are. Like, we didn't know exactly the extent of where those invasive plants are, and you could be like, they're right there.
Yeah, and when one does that, they probably should be taking some preparation to protect themselves from black-legged ticks, because they are
Yes.
out and are highly associated with Japanese barberry. So
Yep. Yeah, and other invasive plants too.
you don't want to just go on a foray and come back with
Yeah.
Lyme disease or anaplasmosis or
Yeah,
something.
if you get a tick-borne disease, that's going to change your plans in a hurry.
That's right. Well, thank you very much,
Yeah.
Ethan. There are still some questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to
Yeah.
capture those.
I was
And
going to say we could just hang on for a couple more minutes. If people have to leave, that's fine, but we could quickly do one or two more and we'll sign off if we
okay,
can, if
well,
that's all right.
anybody who has to leave,
Yeah.
go right ahead. Uh,
Maybe I'll just one more, Lisa.
Yeah, okay. So this one question was, I live in an institution that owns a few hundred acres of forest last logged in part 40 years ago. We want to be stewards. Is the best thing to do just leave it alone? Which I know you touched on a little bit, but
Oh, well, it depends, Lisa.
that was the answer, right?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I think a forest that was logged 40 years ago could look like a lot of different ways, and it could be, if like all the trees were cut, those trees are going to be really small, and it might just be like, we're just going to let these grow for a while. And, in the case of my forest, it was just managed, in this really short-sighted way. They basically just cut all the healthy trees and left all the unhealthy trees. And so what I chose to, and that was 30 years ago. And so what I chose to do was be really proactive about finding every remaining healthy tree that was left, and releasing it from competition. There's this one really great technique that you can find all kinds of resources on, and that anybody can do on any forest, and it works great on these sort of degraded forests. Um, it's called crop tree release. So crop tree release. And it's called that, sort of an antiquated name, because it's, going back to when we think about a tree like as a crop. Just really think about it as like, you have these healthy trees that you want to encourage for all different kinds of reasons, because they're just a healthy tree of a native species, because they're an oak tree that's producing acorns, whatever. And you go and you just find those individual healthy trees that are there, and you release them from competition individually by cutting less healthy trees whose crowns are competing with the crown of your crop tree. And the other trees that aren't competing with your crop trees, you don't worry about them. And it's just like the most efficient way that you can possibly manage a forest. And every single cut that you make, you are proactively helping your healthiest trees out. And it might be that on some acres, if it's a really degraded forest, there might just be one, or on some acres it might be 100. And it's a neat way to do it. I think it's also fundamentally like a more positive way to look at your forest, because instead of sometimes with these forests, you just like on my land, you just go out there and you're like, whoa, God, there's just so many unhealthy trees. It's depressing. But instead, you're like, whoa, there's so many good trees here, you know, and then you release them and it actually changes your perception of the forest visually. Like I had all these areas that I was like, there's no healthy trees here. That's what I thought, by the way, the first time I came to my land. I was like, there's no healthy trees on this whole forest.
Right.
And now, you know, I find a healthy tree, I release it from competition, then it sort of like stands out. And then I find another one, I release it from competition, stands out. And then I have all these other areas where I walk through them with like colleagues, other foresters, and they're like, oh, this is a nice, healthy stand. And I'm like, well, if you walked here with me 7 years ago, you would say this was the most messed up, unhealthy forest you ever seen in your life. So it's pretty neat to be able to have that change of perception.
What is your thought on facilitating, anticipating climate change and planting species that may be within the region but have a more southerly distribution, knowing
I
that?
think it's a neat thing to do. I mean, we call that enrichment planting. So normally what we do is not like full on assisted migration where we're taking a tree and moving it outside of its range, but we're like increasing the representation of these tree species that are at the northern end of their range. So for me up here, that's like white oak, stuff like that, hickories, and so the neat thing to do is I would say if you want to do that, buy trees, you know, not from like a nursery, but from like a place that sells trees for restoration, you know, or from your local conservation district. If you have one that does like a tree sale or something like that, try to get them bare root because we don't want to be moving any like Asian worms around accidentally. And then just if there was an opening, a natural opening or an opening that you created by cutting some trees, supplement the natural regeneration by also planting some of these trees and then protect them from deer browse by putting a tree shelter of some kind. I have a whole system with welded wire fence. And so it's like we're not replacing these natural regenerative processes. We're just like supplementing them with these climate adapted species and just sort of like adding a little bit extra, you know, so that they can be there.
Good.
I think we should wrap it up next, but one last question that you could maybe just spend a minute on. How do you satisfy the need for fire in a responsible way, since you touched on fire a few times?
It's such a good question. So when I was thinking about it, I was in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island is everywhere I go, I'm just like, oh, it's fire. You know, it should be burning all the time. And it's not one of these like pitch pine barrens or a system like that. It's like, oh, it would be like openish canopy oak forest. And you can actually tell there's a species that's there that's an indicator. It's a species in the genus Smilax. It's called greenbrier or catbrier, which is actually like a pretty good indicator of some of these areas that probably had fire history but no longer burn. When they don't burn anymore, it becomes this big, massive, huge, crazy mess. And in that area, it's really hard because the ecosystem's also highly fragmented.
Yeah.
So you can't burn because someone's house is right there. And so then what we try to do is this, and this is actually, I think, a really important concept in ecosystem restoration, stewardship, is that we need to remember that we can attain some of these ecological values, not just like wholesale, where we have a totally perfect representation of a perfect forest type. It's a perfect old growth forest or whatever, but we can also get them piecemeal. So if we have these fire adapted systems and we just can't burn, and I think that there's some cases where we think we can't burn, but if we were a little bit creative, we might be able to. And there's other cases where we just can't. And in some of these places where we really can't, let's think about how many of those values that would be provided by a forest that did burn that we can provide without burning, right? So what burning does is it does a bunch of different things. It lowers canopy density, potentially, if it kills canopy, you know, trees up in the canopy. It creates these more open canopy systems. It prevents the growth of woody stuff, like some of these trees and shrubs in the understory. It encourages the establishment of more fire-adapted trees and shrubs. And it does some work on the seed bed of like, nutrient mobilization and volatilizing these herbaceous species. So they're like in seeds in what we call the seed bank of the soil. And so what we can do is we can try to, without fire, capture as many of those values as we can. So we can do grinding, we can cut trees in the overstory to create more of this open canopy condition. We can cut or grind trees in the understory to try and make room for more of these herbaceous species, and we can plant fire adapted herbaceous and woody species in the understory. And that's sort of the best we can do.
All right.
Good.
Great. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And I think we should end it there. We're after the hour, so I appreciate all your time, Ethan, and thanks everyone for registering. We have recorded, so we will share a copy of that as soon as we can. And I hope you all have a good evening. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thanks, everybody.
Can we
Thanks for coming.
save the questions that came in Q&A?
Yes,
And
I think they are automatically saved, but I will
okay,
try to copy them too.
very
So,
good.
Good night.
all right. Thanks,
Thank you all.
everyone. Yep.
Everybody
Good
have a
night.
great evening.